Good morning, doorknobs. Today is May 14th, 2020. It's actually the 13th, and I'm actually sitting in my classroom doing this lesson today. Um, Watch it if you want. Don't if you don't. But I was requested if I would teach a lesson on the Vietnam War. So I'm going to make it brief as I possibly can. I know I tell you that every day, but I'm going to do my best. I'm going to introduce it, give you a little bit of background and a little bit of what the war looked like as America was involved and why it was sort of I don't know if I should say is a black eye in American history as far as our record when it comes to wars. I guess ultimately, when you come out of the Vietnam War, or you look at how did the United States military fare over the history of all of the United States military, um, we won everything up until maybe Vietnam. And when you look at the Vietnam War, you can't say we lost, but we certainly didn't win. We didn't accomplish the goals that we had set forth in the beginning. So it's the closest thing to a loss, I guess you could say. A demoralizing defeat, and it also maybe set a template for how other countries might be able to stand up against the superpower that is the United States after World War II. So just to kind of put that into perspective, going into World War I, the United States was relatively small and weak militarily. We didn't have much. Um, and after World War II, the United States, along with the British and the Russians, or the Soviet Union at the time as it was called, decided that we should try to remain superpowers. And we kept a huge, powerful military for the purpose of, well, sort of like Teddy Roosevelt at one point said, speak softly and carry a big stick. At that point, he was talking about the United States Navy, which was big and powerful. And the idea is if you have great, big, strong muscles, which for us would be our military, maybe you're less likely to get picked on. If Dwayne Johnson walks into the classroom or John Cena walks into the classroom, nobody's going to call him a wussy boy because he's going to pop your head like a zit because he's super powerful. That's the whole idea. I'm going to guess he doesn't get into a lot of fights, or they don't get into a lot of fights because of that. So we don't become a superpower until after WW2. So the Vietnam War that we fight for over 10 years and don't win is sort of a template for terrorist organizations even today to look at and think about what could we do to stick it to the United States. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to bounce around just a little bit. So this is slide 30 right here, War in Vietnam section 2. I'm going to go back to that fairly quickly, but I want to give you a little bit of a roadmap. This is Vietnam. It's the light colored tan on the eastern side of the peninsula here. And it's a long, skinny country, square miles. It's about the size of New Mexico. It's split into two countries in 1954, North Vietnam and South Vietnam, as the French were forced to leave. So Vietnam and all of Indochina, this whole area here, if my map was bigger, was colonized by the French. By 1954, the French were forced out, and the Geneva Convention sets up two separate countries in 1954 until an election could be held in 1956 to reunite the two countries. They don't reunite, hint, hint. So the capital of North Vietnam was Hanoi, and the capital of South Vietnam was Saigon. So when we look at the two, they act as two separate countries, very small countries. They will come back together as one in 1975 when the United States is forced to pull out. So at the time, it's called French Indochina, and not much on that slide for us. The leader of the North Vietnamese is a guy named Ho Chi Minh. This is a horrible, terrible dictator, a communist dictator who would have had friends in the Soviet Union, which was kind of an American enemy at the time, which would require me to go into several more lessons about how that's possible. But he creates the Communist Party, which you learned about communism in the sixth grade. It's a form of economy, a form of government based on the economy. And anybody that rebelled against the French was imprisoned or killed, which kind of made this guy a bad guy. He had an interesting history. He's fairly well educated, spent some time in America, though there's some question about what he did in America. I think he worked as like a cook in a restaurant in New York or something like that, so not really a big deal. Some time in Great Britain, so he was a worldly man. and he has maybe possibly the worst goatee in all of history, or what we've seen so far. So I'm going to skip over that. Here's part of the reason why the United States gets involved in this conflict, and that's maybe one of the biggest problems with the Vietnam War at the time when it was being fought, is most Americans, well, first of all, no Americans like war, or very few, and second, we don't like fighting in wars that we don't understand the purpose of. And this is a great example of that. But, excuse me, communism was spreading like wildfire. I'm just reading down the slide right now, but the whole idea is we had to stop the spread of communism. So Harry Truman, the president right after Franklin Roosevelt, recognized that America's threat after World War II, when Roosevelt died right at the end of World War II, Truman is the one that was responsible for the choice to drop the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, ending the war with Japan. And then Eisenhower had been the war hero of World War II, takes over after that. They decided to help the French because they understood that America's biggest threat was the Soviet Union, who had kind of come out of the war beat up and bedraggled, but they're going to come out as a superpower. It takes them a couple years later, they come out with an atomic bomb, and they sort of even the playing field, and they become a potential enemy of the United States. So we started dividing the globe between countries that were our friend and countries that were our enemy, our potential enemy. And the spread of communism meant the spread of the Soviet ideologies, of Russia's plan. So we decided we would help the French with this conflict. About the time the United States gets involved, France gives up. Thank you, France. Anyway, here's the idea. If one country becomes communist, it's going to lead to its neighboring countries to fall to communism. Sort of like, and I think you've probably all done this, if you take a stack of dominoes and you set them on edge and line them up in a row and you hit the first one, it's going to fall and it knocks the second one over and blah, blah, blah. How do you stop the domino theory? Place your hand in between two dominoes that haven't been struck yet. That's what America is intending to do, is be the hand that stops the dominoes from falling. So once China becomes communist, it falls. Korea becomes communist, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand. If we put our hand in between Malaysia and Indonesia, maybe we can stop communism from spreading. It's called containment. So that's why the United States initially gets involved. In 1954, the French and Viet Minh create a deal where Vietnam is going to become two temporarily, at least until the United States gets out. Ho Chi Minh is too popular, and the communists would have won had there been an election. Vietnam would have been a communist country anyway. So DMZ, by the way, anytime you see this, means demilitarized zone. So there's not supposed to be, it's a 10-mile wide strip where there's not supposed to be any military by either side. Now, for some reason, my notes get a little out of order in this, and it's been a while since I've taught this, but this kind of comes back to the threat of communism under John Kennedy, so I'm going to skip it. It deals with Cuba becoming communist and becoming Russia's friend, and maybe potentially putting nuclear weapons right off our front porch just south of Florida. We didn't like that very much, so I'm going to skip through that because I want to get back to Vietnam. I'm trying to keep it brief. Okay, so we give the Diem, who's the leader of the South Vietnamese, more aid, and Diem's kind of popular in America, but he's also a little bit of a crook. The Viet Cong, or the VC, are South Vietnamese communists who are fighting Diem's inhumane treatment. The VC, supported by the North Vietnamese, used the Ho Chi Minh Trail to provide supplies. So here's one of the problems with the Vietnam War. They're all Vietnamese. And even some of the South Vietnamese who should have been on our side were VC, or Viet Cong, which means they supported the North Vietnamese. So when America or any soldiers set foot on Vietnamese soil, how do you know who your enemy is? You don't. They all look the same. They all act the same. And even when they don't intend to act the same, when they see Americans around, they certainly act like the allies of America so they don't have to suffer our wrath. So they use different tactics. The Ho Chi Minh Trail is this red line here. So, and by the way, this is all tropical forest. Look at that bridge they're crossing there. No, thank you. I don't like heights. But they used paths through the jungle and the forest that we couldn't see to supply the VC in areas where we couldn't cut off their supplies. We had ways to fight against that I'll get to in just a second. They couldn't compete with our firepower, so they used the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which was hidden, and they used guerrilla tactics or surprise tactics to beat us up. They knew that they couldn't go toe-to-toe with the U.S. Navy or toe-to-toe with the U.S. military at all. So we get involved militarily in 1964. Lyndon Baines Johnson, LBJ, who takes over after Kennedy's death, starts bombing the North Vietnamese. By early 1965, we've got 75,000 troops. Within the year, we've got 185,000 troops. By 1868, there are over 500,000 American troops in Vietnam. It becomes rather big, rather fast. So we thought we'd kick the snot out of them because we were bigger, faster, stronger, and better in every way, shape, and form. But we had some weaknesses. The average age of our soldiers was 19 years old, which means we were pretty young. They were supposed to serve a one-year tour of duty. Many or most of them were drafted, which means they were forced into service. There was no front line. The Viet Cong were everywhere along with the North Vietnamese, so we didn't know really who we were fighting or where we were fighting. And the North Vietnamese used tactics like arming women and children who were supposed to not be targets during warfare or not be targets ever. So yeah, you got children shooting at you and women shooting at you. So now who's your enemy and how are you going to attack them? The climate was different than what we'd fought in before. The bugs were different. The disease would spread. The weather was crazy. They had tropical monsoons for half the year, which meant nonstop rain. So you're always wet, which also meant trench foot in the Vietnam War. They used the VC used a tunneling system, so they burrowed underground. Look at this guy pop up out of the ground, bam, get you. And it was very, very well defined. You know, they could sleep underground, they could shoot from underground, they had ventilation shafts. And imagine being the American or the soldiers that had to go into those shafts to try to root out the North Vietnamese or the Viet Cong that were in them. No, thank you. So their system of fighting was a little bit different. Now, how did we fight against it? Well, in order to expose the Ho Chi Minh Trail, for instance, we used a chemical agent called napalm. Napalm is like a jellified gasoline. So we put this stuff in a bomb, drop the bomb, it detonates, and creates a fireball of an explosion. Also, pause. Agent Orange, as you see, is called a defoliant, which means that as soon as we spray it, all the leaves fall off the trees within a matter of days. So we could fly over with our aircraft and see the Ho Chi Minh Trail. It kind of worked, but then they just moved the Ho Chi Minh Trail, so it didn't really work. And then we find out later on that Agent Orange is a very, very strong carcinogen, which means causes cancer. So many or most or a lot of the men that were involved with using Agent Orange during the Vietnam War would come down with different cancers over their lifetime.
In turn, VC units mount sudden attacks and ambushes on vulnerable American units, then melt into the jungle when help is on the way. Bases along the Ho Chi Minh Trail in neighboring Laos and Cambodia allow the Viet Cong to retreat in the face of superior forces, where the Americans are forbidden to follow. The difficulty of this task is compounded by the ingenious tunnel systems that crisscross this area. Dug by Viet Cong and local conscripts and well camouflaged, these underground structures range from simple spider holes and subterranean caches to elaborate bases with their own hospitals, munitions factories, and printing presses. Deep enough to be invulnerable to all but the largest American bombs, the tunnels allow the guerrillas to find safety and concealment until the Americans pass, then re-emerge with their insurgency capabilities intact.
Napalm was made of gasoline, which was thickened to a gel. Napalm was used by the U.S. military during the war, and it was put into bombs and flamethrowers. Napalm sticks to everything it touches, and it's almost impossible to remove. Napalm was mainly used to wipe out the jungles, but humans would get caught in the open napalm and die not only by burning, but from asphyxiation caused by carbon monoxide poisoning.
During the Vietnam War, the U.S. military sprayed and dumped an estimated 20 million gallons of chemicals in an attempt to destroy enemy hiding positions in the forest. The chemical used in this campaign not only destroyed the forest, but it also caused and continues to cause chromosomal damage in humans. Soon after the war ended, veterans began to complain about serious health problems. They developed painful skin rashes followed by liver diseases and then stomach and lung cancers.
The cancer had erupted on his skin, and 10 months later he was gone.
Agent Orange seeped into the soil and water supply and therefore into the food chain. In this way it passed from mother to children. These chemicals remain in the soil today and are now damaging the health of the current civilian population.
Now, in defense to what America was doing using Agent Oranges, they didn't have an understanding that it was the carcinogen that it is, and that it was going to have those type of impacts on future generations of North Vietnamese. The Viet Cong would collect dud bombs and disassemble them, make traps and booby traps for U.S. soldiers. The idea really that follows us, the legacy of the Vietnam War is a big question mark for us. You know, the men who fought in the Vietnam War oftentimes don't like to talk about it because they saw things that no man should ever see. They did things that no man should ever see, and almost to a man they were drafted to do it. So it was a very unpopular war in American history, and a lot of the young men that came home after their tour of duty, even some of them wounded, were called baby killers, and they were spit upon, and they were mistreated. Whereas I think you and I all have an attitude that of American soldiers, we're proud of them, and we hold them in high honor because they've served our country and they've done what we've asked them to do to keep us safe and protect our freedoms. So it's difficult for us in 2020 to imagine a time when U.S. soldiers and the U.S. flag was so disregarded by so many people. So lots of great Vietnam War movies, lots more information, but I want to keep it to a minimum today. I appreciate the request for me to talk about this. I wish we had more time, but you guys have been a great class all year. Feel free to stop in anytime when you're freshmen, sophomore, juniors. Make sure you send me an email if you have any questions or you have any needs. I'm always responsive, and I'm not going anywhere. So thank you for being great, and thank you for watching my videos and sticking with me through fourth quarter. You guys have a great day and have a great summer break.